Hello, British Literature Scholars. Welcome to the 11th week of the fall 2016 semester. All right, so last week we finished up the Victorian period. We are now in the 20th century. And we're going to start the 20th century with World War One. Yes, we're going to start with World War One, and also William Butler Yeats and T.S. Eliot and Dylan Thomas. A lot of readings here, but they're all very, very short poems. And I think I've got 3 postings for you this week, if I remember right, or maybe it's 2 postings. But here's what I want you to know about the World War One poetry. Go through that slideshow about the World War One poets and review what was going on in the world at the time. The world had never seen anything like World War One. At the time, it was the bloodiest, most lethal war in the history of mankind because it involved so many countries, most of them in Europe. Now, the United States jumped in, and after the Lusitania was sunken, and the Japanese and the Chinese were fighting each other on the other side of the world, so they weren't really involved in the conflicts in Europe. But it was still a war that changed the landscape of Europe. It was still a war that changed how wars were fought. It was the first mechanized war. It was the first war that seriously used air warfare. It was, in many ways, a game changer in wars. Now, what I want you to look at in the poetry here is you start off with Rupert Brooke's The Soldier. And in that, he talks about how great it is to die for one's country and how grand it is to die for one's country. Then you get the poem by, actually you get poems by 2 poets, Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen. Those guys were known as trench poets. These were soldiers that actually saw battle, saw the horrors of the war, and decided to write back and say, you know what, dying for one's country is not all that great. In fact, it's very painful, it's gruesome, and oh, by the way, you might not die for your country, you might lose a leg or something like that. So this was Rupert Brooke represents the beginning of the attitudes towards World War One in Britain as, oh, well, dying for one's country is a grand thing, whereas Owen and Sassoon say, not so fast. This is a horrible thing, and war is a horrible enterprise. And also note that England was barely touched, as far as its island was barely touched in World War One. There was an insurgence by Ireland, though. Ireland decided that since Britain was so busy fighting off the Germans and the Austrians, that Ireland could then declare its independence. So in Easter of 1916, they had the Easter Uprising, which the British military came in and squashed and hung everybody as traitors. Now, because of that, that's your William Butler Yeats Easter 1916 reading. Yeats is an interesting poet because he wrote for so many years. He started as a young man and wrote all the way till he was an old man, and he was relevant throughout all those years. Siegfried Sassoon survived World War One, but he was never relevant again after the war was over with. He did write some poetry here and there, but nobody paid attention to it the way they did during World War One. William Butler Yeats was actually a career poet that people read throughout his entire career. And a lot of that was because of his adaptability. So the Lake Isle of Innisfree is kind of a nature poem. It's kind of a, Ireland is wonderful. It's also influenced by the old Irish music. So there is that influence going on there in his poetry. On the other hand, Easter 1916, there's nothing romantic about it at all. It's actually paying homage to a lot of the Irish patriots who ended up being executed as a result of the Easter 1916 rebellion. At the same time, you've got to understand that Yeats was Irish, so he had those Irish sensibilities and Irish loyalties, but he also was a British poet. And so he was a celebrity in England, and he was well loved by England and by the king, and he was kind of torn when Ireland had this uprising. What do you do if you identify very closely and love very closely both countries? How do you deal with that? And Easter 1916 is kind of one of the many poems that Yeats wrote in trying to work his way through that inner turmoil, if you will. Then he did have a third period, which we're not reading in here, which is featured by a poem called Leda and the Swan. And in Leda and the Swan, he talks about mythology. And so his late years, he went back to mythology and wrote poems about the great heroes there. you could really, I could do an entire semester class on Yeats alone. We don't have that capability here at Darden because this is only a 2-year school. Perhaps I can do that in the new ASU, but really Yeats is a very, very important. In fact, of all the 20th century British poets, he's probably the most important of all of them. Then we've got T.S. Eliot and Dylan Thomas. T.S. Eliot was one of the masters of something known as the modernist movement. The modernist movement was a result of World War I because Europe was fractured and the human psyche was fractured and shattered and broken by this war. So modernism dealt with the inner psychology. So what you've got here is what's known as an interior monologue. In other words, one of the projects of the modernist poets was that they wanted to try and understand how the human mind worked. And as we think, and if you've ever paid attention to yourself while you're thinking, you don't really think linearly all the time. Your thoughts will bounce back and forth and around to different subjects. So what we've got here with the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock is we've got a man who is dressed to the nines, sitting in a brothel, drinking tea, in a part of town that's not so great. And his mind is thinking, he's thinking about, do I dare act this way in front of these pretty girls? Do I dare approach one of these girls? What happens if I say the wrong words? Do I then say, oh, wait, that's not what I meant? Do we then, we keep going on. And his mind and his thoughts bounce back and forth. He talks about, oh, if only I were a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. Right? Ragged claws, of course, that is what we call synecdoche, when a part of something represents the whole. So the claws could mean a lobster or a crab, or even a shrimp to be even more insignificant. So you've got that mindset, that whole interior monologue going on, where he's trying to capture how the human mind bounces around from thought to thought. And then finally, we've got Dylan Thomas, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. A lot of people, when you mention Dylan Thomas, know this poem. Dylan Thomas was another one of those tragically dying at a young age young men. He was a British poet. He came over to New York. He had a brain aneurysm. He died at a very young age. And a lot of that was brought on by his alcoholism. So he basically drank himself to death. But this poem is he's writing to his father as he's on his deathbed. So think of the light as life and the darkness as death. And the light is dying out in his father. His father's on his deathbed. And he's saying, please, Dad, I know everybody dies. Everybody has to die. But please fight this a little bit longer. Please hang on. Do not go gently into that good night or that good darkness, or do not go gently into death. Go out swinging. So, it's a very, very impactful and powerful poem. All these poems are very short. You should have no problem reading them all and enjoying them all, and then doing your postings. Read the questions on the postings to see what I want you to look for in your readings, and then go ahead and do your posting there. Alright, so that's it. So this was a little bit longer video than normal, but you got a few more authors to cover than normal. And I hope that you will enjoy this week's readings, and that your postings will reflect that. And if you have any questions, of course, email me, call me during my office hours, or if you're on campus, come visit.